Okay, so class 8A1 and 8C1. Obviously, you had your maps exam today, so you didn't have a chance to be with me for social studies. This is not really for 8D1 because I'll see them 8th period. But yeah, let's just quickly go through this. So good thing about this is when I don't do this live, you could just move at your own pace. If you need to pause the video, pause the video. But let's first start. You are continuing your notes from yesterday. So it's the same focus question for today. We're still looking at how the captains of industry and laissez-faire led to some big changes in our country and in terms of industry. But let's first take a look at robber barons. So actually, robber barons and the captains of industry are the same people, believe it or not. Yesterday, we looked at the captains of industry. We looked at Carnegie. We looked at Rockefeller in a very positive light because they did do a lot of good things. Now we're going to look at them more as in a more negative way, though, because they did do good things, but they also did some bad things, and we're going to kind of examine them from both perspectives, which is something I try and do a lot in this class. All right, so let's see, why were they sometimes known as robber barons? So when you're known as a robber, obviously you're looked at as some sort of crook. So let's go through and look at why. Well, number one, they were wealthy and powerful businessmen. So right away, and anytime someone has extreme wealth, they're sometimes looked at as a not so good person because they have all of this money, and they're looked at in a negative way. That's been consistent in American history for a long time. Sometimes the rich are looked at in a bad way, and sometimes I can understand that. But from this perspective, we're going to see why they were looked at in a negative way. Captains of industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller would sometimes be considered robber barons as well. So when you look at them from a negative perspective, you would call them a robber baron. If you like them, you would call them a captain of industry. Okay, it was all based on a person's perspective. All right. So let's look at why. Number one, they took a majority of the profit. I mean, when we talk about them being some of the richest human beings to ever walk the planet, they're obviously taking a lot of money. And at the time, there was no minimum wage, so they would pay their workers extremely low. I mean, in a good company, you would hope the better the company does, the more the workers get paid, and that's how it should work. But that's not the case here. They took a majority of the profit, yet paid extremely low wages to their workers. So if you worked for them, you didn't particularly get paid a lot of money, despite bringing in so much money for the company because they're a monopoly. This is, kind of messed up when you really think about it. If you work for a company and when you get older, the expectation is the more money your company makes, the more money you get paid. That's the profit motive. But people back then weren't paid that. And that's, really not fair. Now, should Rockefeller and Carnegie be paid the most? Absolutely. I mean, they're the ones that created the company. They're the ones that are overseeing. They have the most responsibility. Absolutely. Okay, but they should also be paying fairer wages, and that was not something that was happening at this time. So a lot of workers were treated unfairly because of that. I would also say that, Mr. Martinez, our principal, should make more than Mr. Panio. He has a harder job. He does more. He should make more money. But he shouldn't be a billionaire, and I shouldn't be living in poverty. There should be something a little closer, okay? You definitely want the person that does the most work, though, to get paid the most. I think that is fair, okay? Number two, they would squash competition, meaning anyone let's like, if you wanted to create steel, Andrew Carnegie would do things like buy you out. So a way to stop people from, making the same amount of product is you just pay them off. And you're like, okay, I'm going to give you $10,000. I'm going to take over your company now. If you don't take that money, then we're going to outbid you, we're going to outsell you, and you're not going to survive long. So a lot of people were very worried about creating the same product because these companies were so incredibly powerful. All right, they were so strong. All right, it stopped people from doing it. Okay, now in 2021, you have big corporations, of course, and you have small businesses. Small businesses, people that are making products, at smaller stores, can do very well. There may be a thrift shop in the Bronx, where you can go get a set of clothes, or you can go to a Kohl's, or you can go to a Sears or something. Those are bigger corporations, but you have a choice on where you want to go. All right, there's big places, there's small places, and you have your choice on where you want to shop. All right, but back then, not really. And the last thing is we know that they created monopolies, and we know monopolies for the most part are not good. specifically because they could raise the prices of the products, which was a huge, huge problem of the time. All right. So if you're not done, you can pause this. Otherwise, moving on to here. All right. So this is the last slide for yesterday's lesson. So what problems occur when someone owns a monopoly? Or, in the more Regents way of asking the question, when there's too much laissez-faire in government, when the government is too hands-off, when the government's not involved at all in the economy. All right, so take a minute, copy this down, pause the video if you need. So we've kind of alluded to this already, but on the right, I want you to take a look at kind of the answer key from yesterday. You kind of need to know that Carnegie monopolized steel, John D. Rockefeller monopolized oil, okay? Vanderbilt monopolized railroads, and J.P. Morgan, he didn't monopolize a product, he monopolized banks. So John D. Rockefeller is known as one of the richest human beings in American history. He is the richest human being in American history. He had the monopoly on oil, and oil was huge at that time because pretty much all the heat, all the gas was used through oil. If you needed heat, you need to go through John D. Rockefeller. Vanderbilt was very wealthy as well. We know the railroads were very big at this time, a way to transport and trade. You had to go through Vanderbilt for a long time. All right, and J.P. Morgan, he had the banking industry. So if you needed to go to a bank, you most likely had to go through him. If you've ever noticed, Chase Bank was the name of his old bank. All right, he didn't call it Chase at the time, but basically Chase Bank is named after him. So if you type in Chase right now, it's called J.P. Morgan Chase. Okay, so that's a little bit of a fun fact, but that's where that comes from. All right, so let's look at this problem. Number one, monopoly owners consolidate or combine a lot of smaller companies that sell the same product, and that stops competition. All right, and we've talked about how this is a problem. Okay, this leads to the owners making the price of it very high and expensive, and they make the quality of it not so good. And who does that ultimately hurt? That ultimately hurts us, the people, the consumers, the ones that are buying it. Because if you're buying something that's overly priced and overly expensive and you're not getting the right quality with it, you're wasting your money, so to speak. Right? If you go to the deli across the street from PS 89 or the bodega or whatever it is, you buy a bag of chips and the guy says, oh, okay, this costs $8. Like, no, this costs 50 cents, 75 cents, maybe $1. I'm not paying $8 for it. Okay? Well, if he's the only one that sells chips in the country, then you have to buy it from him. If you want chips, that's what you have to pay. But you know that a bag of Takis or a bag of Lay's potato chips are not $8. Just not, no. That doesn't make any sense. Okay? Number two, the captains of industry had a lot more wealth than the workers. This is known as the wage gap. Now, I personally, my opinion, not that it really matters much, I don't have much of a problem with the wage gap. I'm more of a person like, I don't really care that Jeff Bezos has $50 billion. As long as his workers of his company are getting paid a fair wage, then I'm all for it. I don't really care that there's a really rich person and then there's poor people. All right. There's this whole idea is like we need to close the gap between the rich and the poor. And like, I don't necessarily think that's a good idea in my personal opinion, but I could see why a lot of people would think that. All right. What I tend to think is better is we just need to focus on bringing up the wealth of the poor in a company or the wealth of a country. All right. So a lot of people say that a wage gap is a problem. I happen to not be one of them, but you are welcome, of course, to believe that. There's nothing wrong with that. A lot of people do. All right, we'll talk about how that's more of a what's known as socialist or communist idea, but we'll talk about that a lot later on. All right. Number three, workers had to obey the rules of the captains of industry because they could not work for another boss. I mean, this is really such an underrated problem. Really think about it. If I had a problem with Mr. Martinez, I said, you know what? I'm not enjoying my job at PS 89. I need to go to a new school. I can go to a new school, work for a different principal, and work for a different boss. All right. If you were good at making oil, or if you were a train conductor and worked on the railroad, right? If you were a train conductor on a railroad, you only have one boss. All right. And you're really good at, operating a train. You have one boss. So if you have a problem with that boss, you can't quit and go to another job and do the same thing. You have to go do a completely different job. And I know that maybe seem easy if you're a kid, but as you get older, you only become like an expert on a few things that you can do a job really well. So like getting a new job is not easy, very tough to do. All right. So I feel like I'm very comfortable as a teacher. I don't know if I can go and work in construction. I guess I could learn, but like, it's not something I want to do. Right. So you want to make sure that, if you're unhappy with the job, you kind of have to go along with the boss because you can't go work for someone else. All right. So when someone owns a monopoly or the government's, basically letting these monopoly owners just run rampant, this leads to some problems. Now, monopolies don't exist today. We will go over as this unit goes on how we got rid of monopolies. But at the time, they are a problem. So we need to kind of go over them. All right. And they're not a problem for Cornelius Vanderbilt. They're not a problem for JP Morgan. But for most of the country, big problem. All right. So we're going to do a quick lesson before you start your assignment. It has to do with urbanization. I guess I will start with this here. All right. You can just continue the same focus question. It's fine. You don't have to write a new one because it's just one slide of notes. I want you to take a look at New York City prior to industrialization. I wanted you to take a look at New York City prior to the start of this unit, basically. It doesn't look like New York City. I mean, you could tell there's a lot of buildings. You could tell that there's a harbor and there's a lot of ships and there's a lot of trade going on. That is true. Sorry, just have to check something. Okay. You could see that. That makes perfect sense. But you don't have the buildings, the skyscrapers that you're used to seeing in New York City. But by the end of this unit, you're going to start to see those. We go from not looking like New York City to around the end of this unit, 1920, looking like New York City. Okay, and notice this is an actual photograph. This is more of a painting. So New York City had a huge difference in the way it looked in 1870 and 1920. So now we're going to look at why. And it's all going to be centered around urbanization. The population of New York City in 1870 wasn't too crazy population-wise. There was plenty, there were a good amount of people, but not a ton. By 1920, we have so many people living in the cities because if you follow the idea, right, we have more immigrants coming in to work in the factories. The factories are located in the cities. Therefore, more people move closer to the city or live in the city to work there. It's not like in 2021 where I can drive to work. Most people had to live close to their jobs to be any good. Most of them had to walk or take a horse and buggy or take a train. And most people didn't take trains. They just walked to work. So many people started to live in the cities. And with all of this small space, I mean, Manhattan's actually really small comparatively. So what do? We actually say there's nowhere else to go. We need to build in a new direction. We can't build out and east and west. We need to build up. So this is where you start to get the big skyscrapers. And not to go off on a tangent a little bit, but this is why steel becomes so important because the only thing strong enough to hold these buildings in the sky is steel. If you try and build a skyscraper with wood, the thing will topple over within a day. So you need something strong, and steel is that material. So you had to go to Andrew Carnegie to build these cities. Right? So just a little bit of a comparison there. Well, let's take a look at this thing here. So you take a minute to copy this down in red. And this will lead into today's assignment. So I'm actually going to start with this cycle here. So with the rise of immigration into the city, into the country, it's going to lead to a lot more industry. And it's just this endless cycle, right? We already know at this point, as more jobs get created in industry, a lot of immigrants know they can do that job. So a lot of immigrants come into the country. And when the immigrants come into the country, where do they move? They move into urban cities. Okay, so we'll come back to this in a second. So most of the industry and most of the factories took place in major cities. Therefore, not only will we have more immigrants coming into the cities, we will have many former farmers move into the cities as well. So it's not just immigrants, guys. It's a lot of people who were farmers in the South who needed a new opportunity. It was a lot of people who were living out west that, you know what, this isn't working out for me. I need a simpler job. I need something with a boss. I need something, someone telling me what to do sort of thing. And so I get a more steady paycheck. Because if you're a farmer, it's really dependent on how well you grow your crops. And sometimes it's out of your control, especially if it's a bad season, it's bad weather. So a lot of people were sick and tired of that and they wanted a new opportunity. So moving to the cities was a new thing. So obviously you guys live in the Bronx, you live in a city, you see how populated it can get. You see how a lot of people live in this particular area. All right. And urban is just another word for city. So we're actually looking at how and why so many people move to cities. Okay. And often urbanization and industrialization kind of get thought hand in hand, because the thought is, okay, we have more industry, the factories are located in the cities, therefore more people move to the cities to work in the factories. And it kind of just works in that thing. So this rapid movement of people from farmland into the cities is called urbanization. All right, with so many people moving into the city, this will lead to many future problems that the country will need to deal with. Many future problems that the country will need to deal with. All right, and we're going to start looking at some of those later on in Unit 4. But for today, you just need to know that people are moving into the cities. All right, that's really all I need. And again, if you're looking at the urban cycle, since more people move to the cities, we create more industry jobs. And since there's more industry jobs, now we get more immigrants to come in to fill those jobs. Now, as more immigrants come in, more people are moving to the cities because they're moving to the cities, right? And it just works on this endless cycle. All right, urbanization, okay, another big term that we're going to look at throughout this unit. And you're going to see how the cities really started to become, if you're looking at the photos, like more modern. All right, some Regents questions to do before we go into the assignment. Obviously, we're doing this not live, so you just need to pause the video when you're ready. So one reason John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan were sometimes called captains of industry was because they are what? So captains of industry is a positive term for them. Okay, and the reason why they're called captains of industry, leaders of industry, is correct answers 2. They monopolized industrial products that made them extremely wealthy. All right, so they're looked at as the leader of industry because they're some of the wealthiest people in monopolized products. Here's a negative. One reason John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan were sometimes called robber barons was because they what? Okay, and the correct answer for that one is 3. They used ruthless business tactics against their competitors. All right, and that's definitely a problem because they're stopping their competition from succeeding, which makes them more money. All right, so those are the 2 correct answers for that. If you look at today's assignment, which I'll go to in a second, please notice a couple things. You have textbook Thursday due tonight, so please make sure that gets done. This will be your last one for the month of January because we will be reviewing for our midterm next week, which will be on Friday, January 29th. We'll spend all next week studying for it. You'll have a good sense of what's on it. If you've been doing well in class, it's not something you should worry about. It's just stuff you have to kind of prepare for. If you haven't been doing well in class and you've been struggling, or you haven't been taking the test, or you haven't been doing the assignments, the next week is an extremely important week for you to get started on that. So if you want to get a head start on studying, that would be a really good idea. All right, the assignment's pretty straightforward. All right, 1 second here. The assignment's pretty straightforward. You're first going to go, we talked about how we're going to leave child labor. We haven't gone over child labor yet. I want you to read this extremely sad story, okay? And then I want you to go through and answer the questions on child labor. And most of them multiple choice and a couple short answer. These aren't Regents questions. These are just practice questions. All right, and then you have the urbanization reading here as well. Okay, so you're doing both. All right. So the urbanization reading, you're looking at what are some negative effects of urbanization, what are some positive effects, what diseases killed many during the Industrial Revolution, and how are they spread? Okay, you're going to use this short reading to kind of help you with that. All right, that's it. Once you guys are done, turn it in. Have a great rest of your day. Tomorrow.